I'd like to start the month of October with 7 strange tales that cover a wide range of bizarre phenomena, made possible by our wonderful listeners. So sit back and get comfortable as we take a deep look into the unknown.
The first time it happened, I was sleeping and woke up because I felt a hand on my leg and I realized that I couldn't move.
And he come across this object on the ground, which was the shape of a flying saucer. So he jumped out of his pickup and went down there, and there was 4 beings laying on the ground.
When I raised my head back up, I was turning my head, and out of my peripheral vision, I seen something hop to a tree. And it was tall, about 7, 8 foot tall, and it was black, real hairy, like a gorilla.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Nick Ryan, and this is episode 34. Before we begin, I'd like to say a special thanks to Robin, Cassandra, and Brett for supporting our show on Patreon. Your contribution helps make this show possible. Thank you so much for your generosity. We start today's show with a listener story from Antonia. Antonia writes, "Hi there. I've been wanting to share my story for a long time, but never did because I thought that it might be too boring. Though I think that it being not overly spectacular makes it more credible. If you consider it worthy, I'd love for you to share it and maybe ask the other listeners what they think the apparition I'm going to tell you about was." So this happened over 20 years ago, when I was only 10. I'm from Germany, by the way. Back then, things in my personal life were about to take a change for the worse, and maybe that has to do with why this entity came to visit me. My parents had just split up, so my mother was left with me and my 2 little brothers, who were 3 and 5 years old at the time. Before that, times were already rough. I never really had a childhood, as I was forced to experience traumatizing things that I'd rather not bring up here. Those circumstances made me somewhat of an introvert, and on top of that I was always interested in the paranormal and otherworldly things, just to escape from reality for a bit. Up until that one night in late fall 1997, I had never experienced anything paranormal. I was fast asleep in the upper part of my bunk bed. If I lifted up my head, I'd be able to get a view of the little casement door we had in our room. It would lead out to the top of our garage, which we would sometimes use as a terrace, if that makes any sense. My youngest brother was sleeping in the lower part of the bunk bed, right underneath, but with his head facing toward me, so that we could make eye contact in case we got scared at night, which he sometimes did. My other brother was sleeping on a little bed right next to him, also facing toward me. Right behind their heads was the casement door. I remember waking up that night for no apparent reason. When I opened my eyes, I lifted up my head to check on my brothers, but then saw an apparition standing in my room, right in front of the casement door and behind my brothers. I was not scared at all. I was so calm, yet surprised. What I saw looked exactly as how the Virgin Mary is often depicted. A tall lady dressed in all white, flowing cowl with long, wide sleeves, and all-white, big-hooded cape. She had a white cord around her hips, serving as a belt. She looked just the way you'd imagine the Virgin Mary. The strange thing, though, was that her face and hands were covered with what looked like white bandage. I could make out her facial features, but didn't see any skin. She then bent down and carefully caressed each of my brothers' heads with her bandaged hand. She didn't say anything, but I knew she did this to show me that she came with good intentions and that she meant no harm. Then she came toward me, moving very slowly. I was not scared. I clearly remember her standing next to the bunk bed. Since I was sleeping in the upper part, her head and mine were at the same level as she stood there and looked straight at me. It seems scary now, but it didn't feel that way at all when it happened. We would look at each other for a good while until she gently touched my cheek with her hand. I then fell asleep by the touch of her hand and woke up the next morning remembering everything, every single detail. I am 100% sure that this was not a dream. It was real. I remember waking up that night, seeing her so clearly, like she was a real person, and physically feeling her touch. It was a real experience. even though I was not afraid when it happened. I was absolutely terrified every single night after. I would have to sleep in my mom's bed for weeks. It wasn't the apparition itself that had me so scared, as I knew she wasn't evil, but the fact that I experienced something like that made me scared that more people would come to visit me at night. Thankfully, that never happened, and I was able to sleep in my bunk bed again eventually. I am Roman Catholic, by the way, but being baptized is part of our culture here in Bavaria, Germany, and even though my mother believes in God, she never was a practicing Christian, so I and my brothers were not raised in a strictly religious way or anything. I am not a religious person either, but I do have some beliefs that veer toward the concept of Christianity. So, who came to see me that night? Was it the Virgin Mary? Was it a guardian angel? Was it the spirit of a passed-away relative? I'm not sure. All I know is that it was some kind of higher being that came to reassure me that I'd be protected during the even harder times that were about to come. I know that because I felt it when she looked at me and touched my face. That was my story. Thank you for taking the time to read it. I hope you liked it. Greetings from Germany. Antonia. Our next story comes from Mikkel. Mikkel says, "Hello, I found your podcast recently, and I would love to tell you about my late husband, Ryan. Ryan was born very sick, and we knew that one day he would leave us at a young age. Well, he did. He passed away in our house in his sleep, and ever since, my kids and I have had some visits from Ryan. The first week of his passing, I heard babies crying in my room, and a lot of feet stomping around. This went on for months. We hear feet shuffling on my son's birthdays. I have had babysitters quit after one day because Ryan would throw things, bang on walls, and the sound of babies crying would occur every time. On Ryan's birthday, the activity is strongest. On my security camera, we have motion detection. Well, at 3 a.m. on June 22nd, I got a notice on my phone while at work that there was a motion detected. I said to myself, oh dear, the dog got out of his cage. I checked the camera and I saw no dog, but I saw shadowy footsteps on my couch. I also saw something bird-like fly across the camera. I called my current husband from work and I told him that there was a bird in the house. My husband got up and told me that there were no birds in the house. It was then I knew that Ryan was there and finally showing himself as an angel from beyond. Thank you for reading my story, Mikkel." Our next story comes from listener David, and David writes, "Good afternoon. I have just listened to your podcast number 26, Hatman, Lord of the Shadow People. I have had many encounters with shadow people, though I always brushed it off and never gave much more thought to it, mainly since I didn't understand. These encounters would normally be followed by sleep paralysis, and would leave me feeling very weak and tired the next day. The research I did on sleep paralysis kind of confirmed what I always suspected, but still didn't want to believe it until I heard other people's stories. I have only had one encounter with the Hat Man, but unlike other people's stories, he was not alone on the visit to me. He was accompanied by two other shadowy figures, standing on either side of him. I tried to focus and stay with this encounter for as long as I could, but the feeling of their presence was so overwhelming, it seemed to suck dry all my energy, and I fell back asleep not long after. The figures in the Hat Man did not move, though once back asleep, the weight pushing down on me was immense and unnatural. I have had many sleep paralysis incidents of similar feelings, unbearable weight pushing down, and an absolute grotesque feeling of something malevolent or malicious, but nothing compared to this encounter. I often welcome sleep paralysis and the shadow people upon myself to try and better understand this for myself. Though it's draining at times and incredibly scary, I still often have these visits. Unfortunately, I wish I could say this is the worst case of paranormal activity I have encountered, but by far the worst is the Black Wolf, as I call him. Others refer to this as the Dog Man. What I witnessed multiple times almost every night when I was younger was a tall black wolf with teeth always showing, and always standing on his hind legs. These hind legs frightened me beyond anything else, and they were wolf legs, but standing up much like the devil and his goat legs. I was young when this happened, and could never summon the courage to look him in the eyes. This wolf was not something of a good feeling. I feared walking around corners, as he would be in the shadows waiting. I tried talking to him, but the more I did, the less he would show himself. I have not seen this black wolf for many years, but the feelings that came from him were of an evil nature, much like what you would get from the Hat Man, shadow people, and sleep paralysis. Thank you for taking the time to read this. I just wanted to share my story and my side of my encounters. I have never seen a medium in fear of losing what I have, this contact that comes through me, though as I'm growing older, I feel my touch with this paranormal side is weakening, and I'm now considering seeing a medium or someone who can help strengthen whatever this is that I have. I hope to continue my own investigation into this unknown world that many people seem to have encounters with. Thank you, David. Our next listener encounter comes from Dana, and Dana writes, Back in 1982, I was living in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. I was working a construction job because it was winter and my summer job had ended for the season. My job was as a finisher, which basically consisted of filling nail holes on trim all day. It wasn't my favorite job, but it was income. The job site was a group of new townhomes, and along with the construction crew, there were plumbers, electricians, painters, and roofers on site. We all worked from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m., with 1 hour for lunch. While I was working there, I became friends with one of the painters. He was actually a pastor of a church nearby, but had to work as well to make ends meet. I would usually eat lunch with him most days. One particular day, I was in the upstairs of one of the units filling holes. I was getting hungry and yelled down to one of the other coworkers outside the building to ask him what time it was. They yelled back that it was 11:30 a.m. I was glad I only had 30 minutes left until I could eat. I continued working on my task and got to a doorway. When I got to the top of the doorway, I decided that was a good stopping point. I put my materials and tools up and went to the lower level of the unit to wash up for lunch. I went to my pastor friend's car to eat lunch and noticed he wasn't there yet. I figured he'd be there shortly, so I waited. When he didn't show up for several minutes, I decided to go check on him. I went up to some of the other workers to ask where he was. They said he went somewhere with the boss after lunch. I said, "After lunch? It's just now lunch." They laughed, and one of them said, "I wish." I was confused by this, but figured he was confused. I decided to go eat my lunch alone, and on the way I stopped one of the electricians to ask what time it was, so I would know how much time I had left for lunch. I said, "Hey man, do you know what time it is?" He looked at his watch and said, "It's just 3 o'clock." I said, "Your watch must have stopped. It can't be 12:30, if that." He looked at me strangely and said, "My watch is working fine. It's 3 o'clock. Thinking he was messing with me, I asked another person, then another, and I got the same response each time. About that time, the boss pulled up with my friend, and I went up to them, and my friend said, "I missed you at lunch." Now by this time I was getting very worried, because I knew there was no way that 3 hours had passed from asking someone for the time and the amount of work I did in the 30 minutes up to lunchtime. I couldn't understand what had happened. I didn't say much more because I was afraid my coworkers would think I was crazy. That night at home, I was in a panic and very worried. Somehow I had missed 3 hours of time that day, and I didn't remember anything out of the ordinary. In the time it took me to ask someone what time it was, to getting to a stopping point for lunch, 3 hours had gone by. The work I had done would have only taken me maybe 20 to 25 minutes maximum, and I never sat down or stopped for any other reason. To this day, I can't understand what happened to me that day, but it was a very strange and scary experience. Our next story is from Michael. Michael says, "I just discovered your podcast and started listening during work. I enjoy hearing the stories. I wanted to start off by sharing some myself. First off, I find I'm surrounded by people who have had lots of paranormal activity around them, one being my fiancé, and the other being my mother. I've only had one myself, and I will send that in another email with a photo of the ghost. My father is Italian and my mother Spanish. As previous people said in your podcasts, Having a family member of Spanish descent, they tend to believe in lots of supernatural occurrences. My mother would tell me stories of her growing up, and some of them were very frightening. She grew up poor in South America in a very small house. Because she grew up poor, her parents couldn't afford individual beds for her 8 brothers and sisters. Because of this, her and her sisters had to sleep in the same bed when they were kids. One night, my mother went to bed and had a dream about a Native American Indian approaching her in her room. He would take her by hand and lead her into the bathroom. He'd point to the sink and told her that there was gold buried under the sink. One minute the sink was there, the next it was a pile of gold. Every night she would have the same dream over and over again. She never thought anything of it and carried on with life, thinking it was nothing but a dream. A couple years later, my mom and her family moved to the U.S. and would talk about the house. One day she opened up about her dream and she told her sisters. They were in shock, as they all had the same dream in the same way that she did. They later found out that the house was built on an Indian burial ground. To this day, she wonders if she dug underneath the foundation of that sink, if she would have found gold. I asked her if she would buy the house now, but she says she doesn't remember exactly where it was. In her teens, she lived with her family in a brownstone in Brooklyn. Odd things would happen in the house. Things would fly off the shelves. Stuff would fall over, and lights would flicker. They would chalk it up to a ghost. One day, her cousin brought over a friend to sleep over. While the friend was there, they saw these odd things happen and passed it off as ordinary occurrences. My mother's cousin told her friend that there was a ghost in the house. The friend laughed and didn't believe her. She was so cocky about there not being a ghost, she shouted in the house, "If there was a ghost in here, prove that you are real," and laughed with sarcasm after. The night carried on as normal, and everyone went to bed. The next morning, my mother's cousin woke up to a piercing scream. Everyone from the house ran to the bedroom and found her friend had red rope burn marks around her neck. Her friend said her neck burned, and it was hard to breathe. She then believed that there was a ghost. After that, the ghost, or entity, started to become violent and would break glass, throw knives across the room, and even trip my mom down the stairs, or push her. They started to live in terror and called a local priest to bless the house. She said he was there for a few hours, and after that the spirit or entity went away. Not long after that, they moved out of the house into another house across the city. Our next story is from Isabella. She writes, "Hello, my name is Isabella. I have been listening to your podcast and I thought I should share my experience that I had just recently encountered with paranormal activities. It started about 6 months back. My little sister was sleeping in my bed, as she does usually. She's been doing so since the night she ran into my room at 2:30 a.m. hysterically crying, saying she had seen 2 female faces in her window watching her. I got up and told her there was nothing there as we walked to her room. I looked out the window and saw nothing. Then I had her look. She agreed that there was nothing there. In the morning we both told my mother. Saying it was just her imagination, the incident was brushed aside. But a few months later, my sister and I were sitting in my bed. My radio was playing, and my sister was reading, and I was strumming on my ukulele. When all of a sudden, there were footsteps on our roof. My sister looked at me and asked if I had heard that. I said yes, and blamed it on a tree branch that had fallen due to wind. But there was no wind, and no trees nearby. Around 30 seconds had passed, and there were footsteps again. This time, they were coming near my windows. When it sounded as though something had made its way, I started feeling very uneasy. I turned my radio up, and suddenly heard tapping on my glass window. My sister had just laid down to go to sleep. She heard nothing. My nightlight was on, but I turned on my room light. Looking out my window, I saw nothing. Still feeling uneasy, I turned away from my window and fell asleep. I told my mother, and she said that around the same time she was getting out of the bath and felt like something was watching her. She had spoken to a psychic who said that it was a male Native American who was confused about finding the light. My mom is very spiritual and gave me a stick that is to be burned for ridding of negative energy. I burned it in both my sister and my bedrooms, and things seemed to go back to normal. From then on, there was nothing but soft tapping on windows. Until last night. My mom and I had gotten back from a 2-day trip when I went up to my room to unpack. I decided to ignite the stick once more, due to the repetitive tapping. I turned my light off, my room becoming dark. I light the stick and start walking around my room slowly. I reached my windows and passed my first window. Nothing unusual. Then I reached my second window, and that's when I saw it. A head and neck, definitely male, staring at me. Moving slowly closer, but downwards out of view, I ran to my mother. I tell her to go upstairs right now and look out my windows. She was confused at first, and then agreed to go. She asked what I saw. I said I saw a man who was all black. I saw bright yellow eyes, and 3 long downward-facing triangles on his forehead. It also seemed to be wearing a black cloak, but like I said, it was only head and shoulders. She said there was nothing there, and there wasn't when she came, but I know what I saw, and I know how I felt. Scared, paralyzed for the few seconds I saw it, and like I was going to be harmed. It was a demonic entity, and I'm certain it wanted to hurt me. I slept on the couch that night, but continued to hear tapping on the glass. What did these strange sort of entities want? If there are any suggestions what this is, or what it wants, please contact me. Our next story comes from George, and George says, "My story began when I was like 15 or something. I don't really remember the time frame of my encounter with what I call a supernatural entity. We were a simple family here in Cyprus, but I never thought that my teenage years, except from school, family and friends, would involve something else as well to worry about. It all started after my parents got divorced. My brother and I were the targets of constant fights and attacks in order to choose sides, but we were also the targets of a lot of attention as well. This thing caused me and my brother to become closer and develop a bond stronger as we were now facing the world on our own. I was in a very dark place during that time, always asking why and when will my parents get back together, and I started to feel this darkness conjuring in my heart as dark thoughts started to develop in my mind, and then it happened. I remember coming out of my room because I was thirsty. I still feel that moment as though it was yesterday, because it marked my life. I came out of my room facing the small hallway of our house, and I never really looked at the end of the hallway because every night our living room would get very dark. As a kid, I had constant fear of the dark, you see. Well, something that night caught my attention at the end of the hallway. It was a tall man sitting in our moving chair in the middle of the night. My first thought was that Dad had finally come to visit us and Mom. I got so excited, but as I got closer, I felt my heart beating faster. My eyes tearing up from the fear, and a cold feeling covering all of my body, leaving me defenseless as I was just a few steps away from the man. I started shaking, and I couldn't even make any noises. I tried to shout to my mother and tell her that I couldn't move. I was nearly outside of her bedroom door now, but as weird as it sounds, I stood still, facing the man, as he was looking at the door. After like 5 seconds, I could say the phrase, "Dad? Is it really you?" And then I heard it. It was like a scary voice in my head, asking me if I really loved my parents and my dad. I remember literally having a conversation in my head with this man. At least that's what I thought I heard, but it was weird as I asked myself, how can this man hear me? I am not even making any noises, so how can we be talking? Is he psychic? But no, he answered immediately, telling me that he was something even better. I started shaking again, and this time I could feel my senses just returning to me. I thought that since he was staring at the door, and he wasn't looking at me, I would try to take a step backwards, but when I tried, he slowly turned his head and looked at me in the eyes. He had 2 red eyes, shining in the dark, like the most beautiful red diamonds you've ever seen. I asked myself what he was, and then he answered, "Do you really want to know? I am something unique. I am everything you want me to be. If you join me, you can be too." I was shocked. I said, "Please get out of our house." And then he stood up. I remember not being able to see his face, only some characteristics that were distinct, like his eyes, his tuxedo, and his hat, like an aristocrat, just standing there in the dark. I remember crying so much he was getting closer and closer, and then everything just returned to normal when my mother saw me nearly outside of her room, just staring into the unknown. Of course, I asked myself, who will believe me? And the answer was obviously no one, as my family never understood the supernatural things and would laugh at anything having to do with them. I thought that my friends would believe me, and indeed, yes, they gave some advice to pray and go to church, as I was never a religious person, but that day I felt like a mark was left in me. The man in black never stopped appearing since that day. I remember seeing him countless times, even sometimes just a glimpse in the dark, looking at me with those red eyes. Every time I experienced the same feeling, this freezing cold touch, and my heart skipping a beat and pounding so hard, almost out of my chest. Every dark corner he was there. Every time I had a really good time, I remember just feeling like someone was watching me, and yes, I was correct. I know that all this may sound a bit crazy, but I knew something was wrong with me. I started believing that maybe I was cursed or something until one day, it was noon, and I was taking my dog out for a walk in the park. I always try to avoid staying out after dark, because there are no lights in our park where we live. So as I was taking my dog out, suddenly she stood still, like she was staring at something. I remember trying to move her, but she couldn't. She seemed stuck, like she was warning me or something. I thought that maybe she caught a sense of something, and then it happened. As my dog started barking really loud, I remember looking at the road, and there he was, behind the shadow of a tree, and suddenly I realized that it was getting dark. The sun was going down. It was like he was playing with me, as he was hiding behind trees and changing locations like he was teleporting. I panicked, but I said to myself that I must not panic because I was in the middle of the woods, and no one could come to help me out this time. I was focused on my dog, and grabbed her and started running. I thought I was running, but it was like time actually stood still. I was only moving in one spot, like running on a treadmill. We weren't moving at all, and he was coming closer, and I started hearing whispers. My dog went crazy and started barking really loudly. I was lost, and I couldn't figure out what to do, and suddenly, I felt this light shining down on me. The sun was back up again, and he was afraid of the light, apparently. I took my chance and got the hell out of there. When I got home, I noticed that everyone was telling me that I had been gone for hours. From that day, the thought that I remember whispering was a prayer. I was praying for someone to save us, and we made it. From that day, every time that I thought I saw him when I was in a dark place, I focused on happy thoughts and happy positive vibes. I couldn't believe it, but it worked. I thought at the end that maybe I was facing my own dark thoughts. As I grew up, the man stopped coming around more and more, and suddenly he was gone for good. I haven't really seen this man in a while, and don't even know when or remember how he disappeared. But since losing my father in a fire, I believe that I now found my guardian angel. Thanks, Dad. So many amazing stories, and as always, I appreciate all of you for sharing them with us. It's not easy to relive a traumatic experience, especially when combined with the possible scrutiny that goes along with it. If you have a story to tell me, you can email me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com, or you can visit us at paranormal-mysteries.com. Click on the Tell Your Story link. You can also get involved by joining our forum and by following us on all social media. And you can support the show by subscribing and sharing it with your friends. New episodes are available on all of your favorite podcast apps, including Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. From all of us at Paranormal Mysteries, we look forward to talking with you next time. And please remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.